preocupación es más subjetiva.
¿Qué cheque?
La preocupación subjetiva va en el sentido del paradigma. O sea, estamos acostumbrados a seguir una línea y que quizás de repente ese cambio pueda ser sustancial en la práctica.
¿Qué te faltan? ¿4? Sí, dame 4 pesos.
Me llama la atención, así, para la NIIF 13, ¿no? ¿Cómo va a ser va a ser utilizar más juicio, ¿no? Para la NIIF 13, ¿no? Es una cuestión a donde las técnicas de evaluación existen muchas, pero cuando se piensa en un específico activo o pasivo, no se puede tener tantas opciones, ¿no? Entonces, depende de lo que estamos hablando, ¿no? Y el segundo punto es cuál es la consecuencia práctica de esta discusión para la NIIF 19, por ejemplo, ¿no? La NIIF de 19 la estudio desde que se publicó, o mismo antes de se publicar. Es una especialidad muy linda que tenemos en muchos países, es junto con la profesión contable, en otros países no es separado de la profesión contable. En Brasil esto fue la misma escuela muchos años, después se dividió y hoy el actuario es aparte de la profesión contable. Pero ¿cuál es la consecuencia práctica de esta discusión? Yo creo que este es un punto que vamos a desarrollar después en nuestros comentarios. Y también por la NIIF 13, ¿no? Que está en el aire hace años ya. Entonces, ¿cómo estamos hoy con esta aplicación? Entonces, y hay una interrelación entre ella y, por ejemplo, algunos estándares específicos como la NIIF 9 y otros, ¿no? Más principalmente la 9, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que este proyecto piloto es de una profundidad muy grande, porque también cuando ustedes discutieran la parte de relevancia de la representación fidedigna de los estados financieros, esto es una discusión por todos los estados financieros, los marcos fundamentales. Entonces, lo que se discute acá también tiene consecuencias en los otros normativos. Entonces, esto es una cosa que me preocupa un poco cuando se discute todos los aspectos cualitativos para una norma específica, cómo esto va a se interrelacionar con las demás, porque puede traer conflictos, en muchos casos esto ocurre. Entonces, yo creo que es un punto de cómo irán a manejar esto en el IASB, ¿no?
En el propio proyecto, la aplicación del juicio profesional, porque muchas veces, incluso nosotros que quizás somos la profesión que más entendería la aplicación de juicio, muchas veces se interpreta como algo subjetivo y nos olvidamos que el juicio profesional está vinculado a capacidad y experiencia. Entonces, un poco dejar eso tan abierto a la posibilidad de que alguien interprete que subjetivamente puede involucrar cualquier tipo de información que no esté vinculada al objetivo de evaluación, puede quedar muy abierto. En líneas generales, yo vi bastante receptividad por parte de todo el grupo, pero ahí es donde quizás radica la preocupación por el mismo paradigma, porque en la aplicación las divulgaciones se ven como un complemento. Esa es la realidad. O sea, se ve como un complemento. Muchas veces las entidades la dejan a una tarea de un tercero. A veces esa mezcolanza que tenemos preparador, auditor, y realmente no se le da la importancia debida. Y el cambio, que si bien es positivo, quizás amerita, y como lo hablaba el doctor Domingo en una reunión, quizás amerita un proceso de transición que ayude no solamente al preparador, sino a quien va a interpretar esos estados financieros, a quien lo va a usar, a quien, el auditor, los reguladores, este tipo de cosas, ¿no?
Don
Sí.
José, Don José, y la definición de juicio profesional que se usa y que se ha desarrollado en unos estudios del IFAC, ¿no ayudaría a darle un mayor dimensionamiento a eso? Y en nuestro país, por ejemplo, en Costa Rica, uno de nuestros reguladores de entidades financieras tiene una regla de cuáles cuentas requieren, por ejemplo, una cuenta en específico y revelación. O sea, hay un mínimo, ¿verdad?, establecido en función de los activos o los ingresos, que ayuda también como a dimensionar ese tema de juicio, porque usted lo dijo muy bien. Juicio profesional es una cosa y juicio subjetivo es otra.
Okay. Muy bien, Dunia. Esto es una discusión de fondo de la profesión, ¿no? Bueno, tenemos ya a Tadeu y Catherine con nosotros. Yo entonces voy a abrir la sesión. ¿Se están todos a me oír? Ok. Good afternoon for you all. Are you all hearing me well? Tadeu, Catherine?
I can hear you, Jose. Can you hear?
Yes.
Can you?
I can hear you and I can see you in double. Oh, okay. Now you
Yes.
connect
Yeah,
to the
yeah.
other. Yeah.
Yeah, actually,
So-
again, I'm using my mobile to speak to you, but watching through my computer. I mean, it's very annoying. But I'm happy that Catherine, it seems that you managed to get through.
Okay, great.
I
So-
did. I'm very sorry. I've just had a very fun IT debate for a Friday evening, but I'm here in the end. I'm sorry my face is so big. I'm on the phone.
Okay, but we are listening to you well, Catherine. So very welcome you at Glass, and we are, as you might know, we are a Latin American group for studies of international standards, and we are very glad to helping this those outreach, and we first. So then, in name of Glass, we thank you, Tadeu, and all your team and IASB for having this opportunity to get acquainted to the standards and discuss it. And of course, it will help us a lot when we issue our comment letter, in this process of issuing our comment letter, which is ongoing. So, Tadeu, we have, let's say, 1.5 hours for this session, and so then we have with us all the directors of Glass. And Jorge Gil, who is our chairman, is with us as well. I cannot see in the screen, but for sure he's here. And we can, Tadeu, we can start the session now. Your presentation, and Catherine, and during the presentation, the participants can send your questions by chat, or in the moment that you sign on me, we can invite someone to talk orally. So Tadeu, Catherine, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose. Catherine, I asked Dario to actually to pass the slides for us. I mean, that I suppose that it is Dario that's doing that, isn't it? Yes. Catherine, can you see these slides?
I can see them. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, just ask when you need to change. Just ask Dario for the next slide, please.
Okay.
And again, thank you, gracias a todos por estar acá. Yo voy a pedir una licencia porque yo tengo un evento personal de aquí a 30 minutos. Yo tengo que salir, pero yo combiné con José que si quieres hacer preguntas en el chat en español y alguien hacer la traducción, José, para inglés, para Catherine poder entender, por favor, no de hacer la pregunta porque no tiene un poco de dificultad de hablar en inglés. Hace la pregunta en español y nosotros daremos un jeito de hacer llegar a Catherine y también a traducir la respuesta. Por tanto, por favor, si puede hablar en inglés o quiere escribir en inglés en el chat, por favor, haga. Si quiere hacer en español también, no hay problema. Pero Catherine va a responder a todas las preguntas, mismo que tengamos que tener un poco más de tiempo para hacer la traducción. Por favor, participe, es muy importante para nosotros. Catherine, if you just, I'm just asking them if they want to make questions in Spanish in the chat. Don't worry, someone will translate them into English. It's just to make people, those that want to make a question, feel more comfortable writing Spanish, just doing that. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much everyone for having us join you today. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on all of this. What I am going to do is move through the slides fairly quickly. We're talking about a topic that I know Tadeu has discussed with you in the past. So what I will do is run through the proposals in the disclosure exposure draft and focus most on what I have taken to calling the hot topics, which is around the fact that we have now been doing outreach on this for 7 months and we have a good idea of the questions that are most asked. So I will try and address some of those as I speak. As I am talking, if you would prefer to interrupt, if you want any more detail on anything, please feel absolutely free. But otherwise, I will start by running through the slides and then coming to you for any questions or comments. So what I will do is share the proposals, talk about those hot topic questions, and then share a bit of what happened when we tested this project out on a couple of IFRS standards. Moving 2 slides forward to slide 4 though, with any project that we talk about, it is really important to start by identifying the problem that we're trying to solve. Why does this project exist at all? And in this case, it is a familiar problem that we have all been talking about for many years, which is what we call the disclosure problem. And that is really the fact that the information in the notes to financial statements is not as useful as it could be. And that really arises in 3 main ways: an absence of relevant information, too much irrelevant information, and then poor communication of what is provided. Now moving to slide 5. Over the years, the board and the staff have done loads of research about the underlying causes of this disclosure problem. And in summary, what we've learned is that disclosure requirements in the standards are often being applied like a checklist. And those all-important materiality judgments about which information is relevant and material to an individual company and needs to be focused on are not always happening effectively. Stakeholders also told us why this checklist approach happens, as you can see on the slide, and I'll come back to some of those issues when I talk about the actual proposals. Stakeholders also have given us constructive feedback and told us what they want. What do they think would solve this problem? And they have consistently asked for standards level activity, that is, changes to the way the board develops and writes the disclosure requirements in individual standards that would give companies, auditors, regulators the tools they need to move away from this checklist approach, to apply effective judgment and have confidence that they can focus their disclosures on what is relevant whilst also achieving compliance. But looking to slide 6, standard setting is not a magic solution. It won't change the world all on its own, because addressing the disclosure problem is really going to require everyone involved in the financial reporting world to work together and play their part. So whilst these proposals are intended to deliver those tools to facilitate really relevant disclosures, everyone needs to play their part in then using them in the way intended. So in other words, the board are very much seeing this project as a catalyst for positive change. Now, moving to slide 7, before we get into the detail, it is worth laying out how the board has gone about this project, because it is a little bit unusual. So the first step was to interrogate the way that the IASB itself develops and drafts disclosure requirements in the standards, and then come up with a new approach that responds to all of the feedback we heard. We've documented that new approach in what we call the guidance for the board. And having done that, the board's next step was to select 2 standards that stakeholders tell us embody many of the problems that lead to less than effective disclosure, and apply the proposed new approach to them. So the purpose of testing all of this on 2 standards is so that we can show stakeholders exactly what this approach would look like if it were implemented, and that we can you can tell us whether the approach does give you what you need to play your part in disclosing relevant information. So having done all of that, the board then published an exposure draft that lays out both the proposed new approach and the proposed disclosure requirements for the 2 test standards. And until January the 12th, we are looking for feedback. So turning to the actual proposals, and I will start with the approach itself. There's a lot to it, but I will focus on 3 key proposals explaining the feedback we've heard and how what the board are proposing responds. So first, we have consistently heard that companies may not always understand why information is useful, and therefore they find it difficult to make effective judgments about whether particular information is material in their case. So the board's first proposal would address that issue by working closely with investors very early in the standard setting process to understand their needs in depth, what they want, why they want the information, what they're looking to do with it, with a view to explaining all of that right there in the standards so that companies too can understand, well, what is the point of these disclosures? The board would also do outreach with other stakeholders, such as auditors, regulators, companies, to understand their views on things like costs, benefits, practical challenges. In its second key proposal, the board would use the feedback it gathers from those conversations to develop detailed disclosure objectives that, like I say, reflect investor needs right there in the standards. And those would take 2 forms. We would have what we call overall disclosure objectives. There'd be 1 of those for each topic, and it would lay out the key user information need. So, for example, with IFRS 13, it's all about understanding uncertainty exposures, to provide context for the detail that follows, and to prompt companies to think, well, have I actually disclosed all of those uncertainties? Is there anything missing? We then have a number of specific disclosure objectives for each topic, each of which would explain a particular user need in detail and require a company to disclose information that enables that need to be met. And what that would do would essentially require a company to disclose the most relevant information to meeting user needs in order to achieve compliance with these objectives. The third key point is all about language. So each specific disclosure objective would be followed by a number of items of information that you might disclose. However, unlike today, those items of information would explicitly be described as not mandatory. So the board would use the words, whilst not mandatory, the following information may enable an entity to meet the specific disclosure objectives. And what that really means in practical terms is that this perceived checklist goes away. Companies would no longer be required to disclose particular items. Instead, they would be required to apply judgment and meet these objectives. So boilerplate or irrelevant information would be of no use. It would be all about what is genuinely useful. Now, looking at slide 12, one very important thing to keep in mind is that the board is not expecting companies to magically be able to apply judgment when that was something they struggled with before. What the board has done is put loads of tools in the proposals to help with that. So those very specific objectives, the explanations of how the information will be used, the items of information that might meet the objectives, things like application guidance and illustrative examples in areas where we felt that would be useful. Collectively, all those things are intended to give companies the tools they need to apply effective judgment. So moving on to what I call the hot topics, or the questions we get asked most frequently. The first area I'm going to talk about relates to audit and enforcement, which is something we get asked about a lot, and you can understand why. Many people assume that it is very easy to enforce compliance with a checklist of prescriptive items of information, whilst thinking it is difficult for auditors and regulators to enforce the application of judgment. So moving to slide 14, the first thing to say when thinking about that question is that the need to audit the application of judgment is not new. It is the case already that individual standards do contain these prescriptive requirements to disclose particular information that many perceive as a checklist, but there is also an overarching requirement in IAS 1 to apply materiality to everything. So the proposed approach is not bringing in a need to audit judgment for the first time. Instead, it's making that need more prominent at an individual standard level. And in fact, the very problem we're trying to solve is that that judgment that is already required today is not happening very effectively. And we are told that that is because today, if an auditor wants to challenge a company about whether something additional is needed or whether a different disclosure is better, then all it has to work with is that very general IAS 1 requirement that essentially says, if anything extra or different is material, you need to disclose that too. And what we hear is that that very high level requirement just doesn't provide a strong enough basis for auditors and companies to have really useful debates. So the practical consequence is everyone takes a risk-averse approach and sticks with this checklist. So slide 15 looks at how the proposed approach would help with all of that. And really, there are three things to mention. First is all about this reinforcement of that IAS 1 requirement at the level of an individual standard. It's impossible to achieve compliance with a required objective without applying judgment. And so when an auditor wants to challenge a company on the application of these proposals, what it would be able to do is point to the precise user need in the standard that it doesn't feel has been satisfied, and have that strong basis for discussion about what needs to change here. So the compliance question will no longer be, has a company disclosed this piece of information? Instead, the compliance question will become, can a user understand what's going on here? So a much more fruitful and material conversation. Second, all of those tools I mentioned that the board has put in to help companies will help auditors and regulators too. And finally, it's important to keep in mind that the board has developed a super robust process to make sure not just that the tools are there, but that they contain all of the right things. So one example is those detailed conversations with users. Another is common practice reviews, where we look at typical disclosures that companies give, and if they are often giving some piece of information additional to what's in the standards, then the board will consider whether that is demonstrative of a user need that should really be captured by the requirements. So the board has done a lot of work to make sure that the common user needs are described in the objectives and the items of information. So overall then, applying this approach, auditors will have a lot more to work with than they do today. The next hot topic I'll talk about is comparability. And again, this is a great question. We tend to get asked, well, if these proposals are all about enabling judgment, enabling relative entity-specific information, will comparability between companies suffer? And hi.
Sorry, interrupt if I may. So, well, it was a very important part of your presentation, I think, when we talk about judgment, no? And at glance, we discussed a little bit about it in our working group. And lo que es juicio, no? So then this question about what is judgment, it's very important because we see regulators defining it. And you know, when we report to investors, we are reporting to regulators too, and analysts, investors as well. So one of the things that we consider in our discussion is that some kind of, it's difficult to say guidance, but some kind of discussion in the future standard is very necessary to protect as well the preparers and when discussing with the auditors exactly what was the selection of variables, selection of scenarios that the preparer adopted. And so then I don't know if you have any comment about that, and I encourage any other director here or participants here to comment too. Entonces, yo que estoy hablando es que el documento necesitaría tener algún tipo de discusión para aclarar bien lo que es juicio, ¿no? Porque los reguladores están de ojos abiertos para esto, y esto es un punto muy importante. Entonces, lo consideré esto con Catherine. No sé si quieren hacer algún comentario. En este punto de la presentación, esta discusión es importante. Mas, si están de acuerdo, entonces vamos a ver el comentario de Catherine. Catherine, it's
José, if I can just, can I? Yeah.
Hi.
Just one second. I think maybe it is better if you can
postpone.
Let Catherine finish the presentation, and then we move to the questions, because actually otherwise I'm just concerned about the timing. I think that if she can she probably is going to end quickly the presentation, and then we can open for questions. I think that it will work.
Great. I'm keeping an eye on the watch, but the time. But Catherine, it's a consideration by the moment, but feel free to comment it later, and I will keep the question more to the end of your presentation. But it's very key for us this point, so that's why I couldn't refrain myself to tell you that.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Well, what I might do then, because I think Tadeu raises a good question, a good point about time, and I am very, very keen to hear all of your questions. What I will do is just talk about, I've got two remaining hot topics, as I call them, and I can tell that you have read the proposals. What I might do is stop there rather than summarising the two standards. Me to then cover the two examples. We can do that. So I will just run through the two remaining hot topics because they are very related, and then perhaps we'll go to questions. So very related to judgment. In fact, the second one I wanted to cover was comparability. So as I said, we've had some very valid questions about whether this increased level of judgment would mean that companies would be disclosing different things in similar situations. So really, two things to say about that. The first is that uniform or identical information is not the same thing as comparable information. So if you have two companies for which the same things are material, then disclosing identical information can be extremely useful. However, if the companies are different things are material to them, then forcing them to disclose identical information could actively be misleading because, for example, it could give the impression that the disclosures of both companies are complete because they are the same, when in fact one of them might have some entity-specific material thing going on that has been missed, and the other one might have disclosed loads of stuff that's actually irrelevant and is clouding what is really going on. So what matters, I think, is what we tend to call meaningful comparability, which is enabling users to compare the material information for one company with the material information for another company. And the board's proposals are intended to do exactly that. In terms of how, I talked earlier about the need for all of us in the financial reporting world to play our part here. And really, this is about the board doing its part of the process well and doing that really important work with investors to develop proposals that are genuinely good enough to enable companies to identify everything that is material in satisfying the objectives. So the idea is that the proposals are specific enough about user needs and contain enough tools in terms of explanations of how things will be used, items of information, application guidance, and so on, that a company would be able to identify everything that was material. And therefore, if the same item is material to two different companies, then we would expect them to both disclose it, thereby achieving that comparability. So the board's conclusion was that it thinks the proposals are specific enough and good enough to achieve comparability where it is important. But of course, the testing of this on our two test cases is super important to hear from stakeholders about whether that has been achieved. Can you actually make those judgments effectively? The final hot topic I will talk about, turning to slide 17, is about digital reporting. We are frequently asked, how will all of this work in an electronic world? And in fact, will it work? So in thinking about that, what the IASB did was consider exactly how the proposals could be reflected in the IFRS taxonomy, because that provides a real concrete example of how this would work in a digital reporting environment. And to summarise, what the board envisaged was that everything named in the proposals, every objective, every item of information would have an electronic tag of one form or another associated with it, so that companies could use those tags to consistently tag information in their notes and enable investors to electronically extract the same information from each company. An investor could say, give me everything related to this objective for all of these companies, or it could say, give me this item of information for every company for whom it's material. Which leaves the final and possibly most important item when it comes to electronic reporting, which is what happens when a company applies judgment and discloses a piece of information that is not explicitly named in the standards. And the answer is, well, exactly the same thing that happens today. A company would need to create a company-specific electronic reporting extension to tag that item electronically. Now, one thing we do hear sometimes is a concern that the proposed approach would lead to loads of these entity-specific extensions and therefore reduce the ability of investors to extract that comparable information. And the board's mitigation of that risk is really similar to what I talked about on comparability. It's about getting the proposals right in the first place, because if the board has done its investor outreach well enough, has done those common practice reviews, then everything that would be relevant and material to multiple companies should be named in the proposals and therefore should have an electronic tag attached to it. And so companies would be able to use those standard tags. The other important thing to reiterate here is that in those circumstances where information is genuinely entity specific and therefore not captured in the proposals or electronically, a company disclosing real entity-specific information is a good thing. To be frank, it's the absence of that kind of entity-specific information that we are trying to address with this project. So in the same way that those entity-specific electronic reporting extensions already happen today, there will still be times when they should rightly happen using these proposals. If companies are disclosing relevant things, then that is a really good outcome of this exercise. On the other hand, where companies are disclosing similar information, then the board has concluded its process is good enough to capture that, get it in the standards, and therefore get it into the electronic reporting world. So that was the last of what I've called the hot topics. The last couple of slides, I was going to give a high-level summary of the proposals for the two test standards. I think what I'll suggest is that we maybe go to questions, because you've clearly read the requirements. So if you'd like me to do that summary of the two standards, we could maybe do it after you've had a chance to comment on the big picture.
Thank you, Catherine. Catherine, I'm not, actually I am abandoning you. I have a commitment that I have to take my kids to a place and I have already agreed with Jose that he would help me after that. I'm really, really sorry that I have to leave now, especially because we started later, and then I thought that I would cover most of the presentation, but unfortunately it wasn't happen. And then I really regret, but I have to leave. But you are very well accompanied, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you.
We granted. Okay, thank you, Tadeu. You are
Gracias a
forgiven.
todos. Gracias.
All right. So, Catherine, I think that I commented on judgment, and now a new word was introduced as a meaningful comparability. I think it's a concept that is very interesting to discuss, and it's quite new when we approach it. So we are emphasizing some remarks that the group made until now, and I don't know if you, for example, when we discuss about judgment, is something that a third party can reprocess your information and achieve the same result. It's a good judgment, isn't it? So these are some comments, initial comments we have. No specific questions until.
Okay, I mean, it's a really important topic to raise, and what is very useful for us in a feedback sense is almost whether with the two test cases are the proposals specific enough to allow you to be confident in making or indeed reviewing for the auditors and regulators those judgments. So your views on that are very, very valuable to us.
Okay, Catherine, and another point is this proposal will represent that all that disclosure requirement in the end of the standard will be significantly reduced?
Are you asking about the requirements, i.e. the content in the book, or are you asking about companies' disclosures, i.e. how long their note will be?
Oh, good. In the book.
Okay, because I mean, there will be. I mean, you'll have seen the proposals for the two test standards are physically quite long, because they do go into these explanations about user needs, which simply weren't there before, and then they also go through all of the items that might meet that. So literally the proposals are long, and there are a lot of items of information precisely to help companies understand what the board had in mind and give them tools to apply that judgment. So if I take the two test cases as an example, I'll actually, what I will talk about is, I think, the pension case and focus on defined benefit schemes. Today, those that have to give those disclosures will know that the requirements in the standard go on for a long time, and there is a huge list of prescriptive requirements. In these proposals for defined benefit schemes, we have 6 specific disclosure objectives. So 6 requirements to disclose something that will enable a particular user need to be met. Now, all of those objectives are supplemented by items of information that might be used to meet them. So the literal answer to your question is almost there are less things that you need to meet because the requirements are the 6 objectives, but the amount of sort of supplementary information to help you meet those is voluminous. So there's a lot of guidance there, but the requirements are bunched into these. This is the underlying user need. One thing I would add is that in terms of volume of actual disclosure notes, the volume wasn't really the intention, because for some companies today, they might be disclosing loads of irrelevant information, and if they apply this properly, their note will get a lot shorter, and we have seen that with some of our fieldwork participants. On the other hand, there are companies that might have missing relevant information and will need to give more. Again, we've seen that with some of our fieldwork participants, and then there are companies which both will be true, and they will just change things, and volume could change in either direction. So it's not a straight answer to the volume question, I'm afraid.
It's the relevance of information, the importance of the disclosures. So one thing that we would expect is that we should reduce the quantity and improve the quality of information. It's one concern that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a wonderful outcome of the proposals, you know, and if you read the 2 test cases and think they could better facilitate that, then yeah, we please tell us how, because that really is an important, you know, more relevance and is super valuable.
Okay. Catherine, you can proceed with your presentation. We don't have more questions.
Okay, so the last section of the presentation is about the 2 test cases. I am going to keep it relatively brief. I could actually talk about these 2 test cases for a long time. As you can imagine, we think about every single word that we propose, but what I will do is run through the high-level key points. So I don't know if we've still got the slide, but you may have the pack in front of you. On slide 19, we talk about the proposed amendments to IFRS 13, which is the fair value measurement standard. So, and if I were to sum up...
Sorry, Karen, interrupting you. A presentación, Darío está haciendo presentación. Porque no aparece acá en
Sí,
la
sí,
pantalla.
sí. ¿Quiere que la comparta nuevamente?
Sí,
Sí,
la
por favor.
página 19, yo creo. Page 19, ¿no, Catherine?
It is page 19, yes.
Okay, 19, sí. Sorry.
Ya la comparto. Va a cerrar.
Okay, should I
Yeah.
carry on? I don't know if you guys may have your own copy of the slides. I think Tadeu may have sent them. So on slide 9. So on slide 19, if I were to summarise everything we heard in our investor outreach here and our outreach with companies, I would say that the disclosure challenges with IFRS 13 are all about materiality. So users tell us they often get pages of information about immaterial fair value measurements and little information about those fair value measurements that they think are most important. And at the same time, companies tell us those pages of information are onerous to prepare and that users rarely ask any questions about them. So to sum up, therefore, it's not that we have heard that the technical content of the IFRS 13 requirements is the wrong content. It's more that disclosure information is not always being provided about the most useful population of items. So you could say a good response to that feedback would be a set of disclosure requirements that helps companies to focus their information on the fair value measurements that users are most interested in. And the board's proposals are intended to do that in a few ways. The first is by developing disclosure objectives that explain those investor needs in detail. So across all of the board's discussions with investors, a key message that came through was about understanding exposure to uncertainty. So exactly what fair value measurements does a company have and what are the uncertainties surrounding those measurements? So the board has proposed an overall disclosure objective along those lines, and then that theme of uncertainty is then reflected across all 4 of the proposed specific disclosure objectives on this topic. We summarise them for you on slide 20, but essentially what those objectives do is ask a company to lay out, okay, what fair value measurements have you got in each level of the hierarchy? What is the nature of those? Tell us, you know, are they subjective? How are you valuing these things? If I can't understand that from the one-line description in a table, you need to give more information. To understand measurement uncertainty, how different this could be, and how fair value measurements have moved year on year, so investors can understand what is causing changes in fair value measurements and where that uncertainty might lie. So the second way the proposals respond to the feedback we heard is by requiring companies to focus on the appropriate level of detail and ensure that relevant information is not obscured by insignificant detail. And that's really intended, again, to reinforce that materiality requirement in IAS 1 and give companies an additional piece of confidence in this individual standard that it can apply judgment, it is supposed to eliminate immaterial information and focus on those measurements that are the material ones. Thirdly, the proposals avoid referring to levels of the fair value hierarchy where that is possible and where it is helpful. And that is really to remove any perception that detailed disclosures should be provided for fair value measurements in particular levels, regardless of whether they are material or not. So typically what happens is that we see companies, or investors see companies, with very little in level 3 and huge amounts of fair value measurements in level 2, and yet they might get 8 pages of data about level 3 and very little about level 2. And investors, coming back to those objectives about uncertainty, investors see the fair value hierarchy as something of a continuum. The stuff in level 2 might be close to level 1 and not have any uncertainty at all. That's fine. Then you don't need to disclose anything to meet those user needs about uncertainty there. But if your level 2 population has any element that is close to level 3 and is a bit subjective, users want to know, well, that population exists and they want to know some information about it. So by taking away these references throughout to level 3, the board is giving the message that companies are expected to disclose material information about material fair value measurements rather than going, I disclose loads of information for this population regardless of size. The final point I'll mention on IFRS 13 is to come back to my original point, that really what we heard here was that it is about materiality and the technical content tends to be useful. So what you see in these proposals is that many of the items of information are similar to what you give today, and the key change is all about using those objectives to focus on that which is material with that information. Moving on then to IAS 19, which is employee benefits. I'm going to focus on defined benefit plans because a key message coming from our outreach was that defined benefit plans are where the risk is, and therefore these are what users are most interested in. So the board has heard that the single most important information about defined benefit plans is generally their cash flow effects. But users say they often get very little information on this. Another problem relates to ineffective communication. We hear that users receive pages and pages of detailed pension disclosures, but they can't always piece together the information and understand how it relates to the primary financial statements. At the same time, companies say those pages of information can be onerous to prepare, and actually they understand why users ask for cash information and agree that it would be more useful. Often companies tell us that they need that information to make decisions anyway, and they already monitor it, so they could disclose it. So putting all of that together, everything we've heard suggests that applying the proposed approach to IAS 19 could have real benefits in terms of relevance and in terms of effective communication. It could avoid companies spending time preparing disclosures that are not the most useful, and it could result in better information for investors. So on slide 22, again, what we have done is lay out the topics covered by those specific disclosure objectives. In this area, we have 6. I won't talk through them all, but essentially they each pull out a very particular investor need here. So you can see, for example, we have a specific disclosure objective capturing that need for clear and effective communication, something that we often describe as an executive summary. Another of the 6 disclosure objectives directly addresses that need for cash flow information, and with that objective the proposals go on to give loads of application guidance and illustrative examples, because this is an area where companies will have really different and unique schemes and the best information to meet the objective might vary. And the other objectives go into different particular areas. So, for example, how long do investors need to keep worrying about closed plans for? Is there any uncertainty here that they need to worry about? That kind of thing. So that's the summary of the 2 standards. Just the final slide in the pack that we sent to you essentially tells you how to get involved, how to submit a comment letter and such. So I will just end by reiterating how incredibly valuable feedback is on this process. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your comments, your questions, and ultimately seeing your comment letter. But I will stop there and see if there is any more thoughts from you guys.
Great, Catherine. Thank you very much for your presentation till now. And I'm seeing if we have any question or Someone want to make any specific question to Catherine?
Yes.
Felipe?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine, for an excellent presentation. Very, very clear. And we appreciate your support for GLENIF for GLASS. I wonder if I am right saying that the two main characteristics of this project are materiality and the other is judgment. Am I right in saying that? This is because all the discussion goes around these two aspects. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that is a very, very fair summary. It really is all about materiality, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other, you have several visual aids saying that the disclosure's objectives are to respond the investors' needs, for investors to understand the information. I wonder how to respond to other users of the financial information, because the financial statements are not only for the interest of the investors. What is the situation in that case?
Yes, that is a very, very good question. And to clarify, because I think sometimes we perhaps don't draft, we haven't drafted that point as clearly as we should. The users in question whose needs these proposals aim to satisfy is the primary users of financial statements as per the framework. So you're right to say it is the full population of those. So yes, I do refer only to investors too often. I apologise, but we do our work with the full set of different users whose needs the proposals are ultimately trying to help companies satisfy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Catherine. If I may, just to use a little bit of what Felipe was saying, and I've seen that in the proposed amendments, we do not call them investors. We speak users, just like you said. But at least seems to me from all the documentation that we have around the project presentations and all the discussions that we have with board members, it seems to me that there's a very, I would say, explicit focus on investors. So this is one thing that in our jurisdiction in Brazil, we have discussed a little bit, it'll probably be part of our letter, that as we look at the needs of our own jurisdiction, even though investors play a great role, we have other groups of users that are of equal prominence as compared to investors. So one concern that we have is that at some point, as the board in its standard setting process focuses too much on investors when getting feedback to address to determine what are the general disclosure objectives, the company, when they're looking at the specific disclosure objectives and how do they meet the needs of their users, they're looking at a user that's different than the user that the board was looking when discussing the standards. So that's one thing that for us is important that you take into consideration, the concern that we have in Brazil. And just to also address a different topic, I know the views of the board as to uniformity and comparability. And of course, we know the guidelines of the framework. It's an explicit statement of the framework that comparability and uniformity are not the same. But I think it's important also to share the feedback that we're receiving from some investors, especially, that even though this is the view that we have in the principles of IFRS, for many investors, uniformity and comparability, they still tend to be similar circumstances. So in their views as to what they are looking for in the companies that are making their analysis, in some situations for them, their understanding is that uniformity would equal comparability at times. And as we talk about the different users, I think this is one thing important, because when you look at the guidelines for users and the principles of IFRS, you're talking not only about the investors, but also potential investors. And potential investors, they like to put information side by side and see how do they correlate to make their decisions. So this is just also, this is a feedback that we receive mostly from investors, not from the accountants. But some investors are kind of concerned that as we draw those differences between comparability and uniformity, this may not reach their understanding of what that would be in financial information. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really useful feedback. Just to say, in case it is sort of helpful to draft in your letter, on the point about different users, you did mention the concept of companies having almost perhaps to talk to users that are different to the set that the board has identified. The intention of the proposals is that the board, it's the board's responsibility to communicate what you have to comply with, and therefore it should have communicated user needs in the standard. If in addition to that point you think that that is not complete because the user set is not thorough enough and there are things missing, then that is really important feedback, because the expectation is not that every company should go and have to talk to its own users and work out what its needs are. The board does take the responsibility for properly identifying those needs and getting them in the standard. So yeah, just to reiterate the value of that feedback, it will be really important to us.
If nobody's coming with a question now, and if you don't mind, I have another one. I just didn't want to, annoy you.
I have one here, Patrick. We have a question that came from the working group. Afterwards, you can do yours, Patrick. Sorry. Some participants in the working group consider that it would be prudent that during the transition period, a kind of guidance would help this transition from a culture of requirement or of prescriptive culture to a more qualitative or judgmental culture. So it would help a lot if we have some kind of guidance on that, and based on the capacity. So different entities has a different capacity or experience of dealing with that. So then, and in many circumstances, we noted that one company they ponder more to provide all kind of information, even if it's material or not. So then the notion of materiality that will be very, very useful in this scenario would be helpful if you provide some kind of guidance on that. And I know that materiality is something that is being discussed for a while in the profession, and the auditors are more willing to deal with that. So so that's one comment that we have, that some transition is necessary for not exposing the preparer to any kind of consequence, undesired consequence of that.
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
And the other comment is the cost benefit of implementing this approach. And so it's a general concern. I don't know it will be more costly or not, but the cost benefit is always a factor when you decide to disclose an information as a preparer. But we know that we have to look on the users, on the user side. So we know that we have it's a request for information, so we don't have any additional information to be based in, because a lot of things will be developed by the board. So it's something that we are very concerned about the cost of providing this information.
I understand. Yeah.
So these are some few questions that that came from the group. Of course, we are in the middle of this process of analyzing it, and then the group will have other meetings to discuss further. And for sure, what we are having here today will assist them on that.
That's helpful, thank you. One thing to add on cost, that the board's expectation was almost that the first year would be particularly onerous in terms of resource, because it's such a new way of thinking, but that the ongoing costs might, you know, reach more of a normal state once that change to a new approach had happened. So I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I just raise it because it might help your thinking in terms of giving feedback on costs to the board.
Okay. Thank you very much, Catherine, for this comment. I think useful. Yeah, because sometimes the discussion is quite subjective, and so I don't see that in a standard that is in the air for a while. An improvement. I consider that will be an improvement. So an improvement will focus on what is relevant, on what is important to be disclosed. So not necessarily we are going to incur an additional significant cost of implementing it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm right, if I read you right.
Yes.
Thank you. So Patrick, I think you have another question.
I was just gonna add to, I think it's quite similar to what you have been discussing, Jose, is that it's very important for us, and this is also connected to the feedback we received from in our jurisdiction, that we have some good clarity as to how do we achieve the objectives, because at the end of the day, if there's really uncertainty by the preparers as to whether the disclosure objectives have been met based on the work that they have done, we may eventually end up defaulting to the addition of information just to make sure we wouldn't be questioned, which is pretty much what we have already today and what we're trying to tackle. So if for some reason there's no clarity or clear guidelines as to how does the preparer assess that he has achieved the disclosure objectives, he may end up adding information just to make sure he's not questioned by the auditors, by the regulators and stuff. And especially in certain jurisdictions where the financial statements are kind of a legal document that you may have litigation based on the information there. So preparers tend to believe that the more information, the better. I'd rather have a problem with more information than with fewer information, because I tend to go to litigation when I do not have the information, not when I have, too much information. So this is one thing that we're hearing in our jurisdiction, that it's really important if we can have like application guidances or more detailed examples. I remember there was an interview back then. I don't know if it was an article. I forgot who was the board member, but he wrote an article some time ago providing some examples and case studies that of disclosures that have been improved. That's a very good example. So this is important for the preparers to make sure that they are not just defaulting to add information to prevent being questioned,
Yeah, in the top of that, Patrick, we have some participants in the working group that are very contrary to to go to a fully judgment approach. So they still stick on having some kind of prescriptive guidance. So it's kind of culture, And one important point, Catherine, is usually we know that in Latin countries we are more based on the Roman law, and we are very prescriptive in anything we do. So it's difficult sometimes to change a little bit this mindset. But IFRS has a lot to do with principles and concepts, and so we are dealing with that on one way or another.
Yes, it does indeed. Very principles based.
Yeah. All right. Any more questions? We are just quite in the end of the session. So
I have another one. Can I just ask another one? I just want to make sure that I address whatever our respondents in Brazil are asking. Because again, when I bring those comments, some of those, of course, are our views, but we had a very wide group that was participating in discussions, from investors to banks and accountants. So we get some very good feedback. And one thing that maybe wasn't very clear, and maybe Catherine can talk about that a little bit, is on IFRS 13, the disclosures that are being suggested for alternative methods of valuation. When I look at the examples that were provided, they look to me kind of like a sensitivity analysis that we have for significant assumptions, which is pretty much what IFRS 13 already has. But it wasn't really clear to me whether we're talking about assumptions or actual methods. For example, we are looking at an alternative method that would change from income approach to the market approach or cost approach, or is it more an exercise of sensitivity analysis? I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. So with that objective, in terms of background, the feedback we got from investors about sensitivity analysis when we were developing this was that they felt that these assumption by assumption sensitivity analyses that they get today, they can be very detailed and complex, and often they don't reflect realistic scenarios because assumptions don't move in isolation. So investors explain to us that their underlying user need, sort of the thing they really want to understand is, how different could this be? I.e., you know, how big could the exposure be beyond what's in the balance sheet? And so the objective, the actual compliance requirement, is information that enables users to understand alternative measurements that would use inputs that were reasonably possible. So it's not the case that companies are expected to undertake different valuation methods. It is about inputs, so it's reasonably possible alternative inputs, and how different could they realistically be. So then in terms of how you comply with that, you're absolutely right to raise sensitivity, and you'll see that, you know, in the first of the ways you might meet it, it does sound very similar to sensitivity in terms of the effect of an individual assumption moving. And that's really because from a company perspective, and this has come through our field work as well, depending on what you're dealing with, there may be different ways to go about this. So for example, we've had a lot of fieldwork participants who are valuing investment properties, and their view is that for investment properties, those individual assumptions, you know, they actually are sort of moving in isolation, and a sensitivity is genuinely the best way to meet that required objective. Okay. On the other hand, we have come across other companies who themselves, you know, in managing the potential risks around these measurements, they do not think that individual assumptions will move in isolation, and they do think about potential ranges. I've got this item that, you know, I think it could be between 90 and 100. My balance sheet says 95, and my assessment is that the risk is kind of 5 either way. And to them, that is a more useful disclosure. So this really talks to the value of the judgment, in the sense that the underlying user need is, how much do I have to worry about this? But depending on what you're valuing and how you're valuing it, it may be that there is a simpler and more concise disclosure that would tell a user that. In other cases, those sensitivities might be best. So apologies for the long answer. I hope that's helpful. It's really about giving what is most relevant in a particular case.
Not at all. They're very good responses. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, it was very clear and in accordance with the complexity of the issue. No? So, Catherine, well, as we are ending our session, if we don't have any more questions, I should say that we are completing our process of analysis. The due date will be next year, but just in the beginning of next year, so we don't have too much time allowed. And we are going to be discussing it in the coming weeks. And I think the inputs we always have from IASB presentations are very helpful, and we thank you for that. And thank you all the participants for being here today. Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been good to talk to you.
Thank you very much. And so, see you next time.
Catherine. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. I look forward to your letter.
Thank you,
Have
Catherine.
a lovely weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be safe.
Bueno, le pedimos a los directores que si se pueden quedar, por favor.
Ok, Jorge, acá
Voy a cortar la
estamos.
transmisión en vivo. Aguarda un minuto.
Ahora cierra la transmisión.